Good morning. Good morning. My name's Jamie White. I'm fortunate enough to be the president of your Pittsburgh NAIOP. And I see a lot of new faces in the room. And just so you know, if you guys don't get quiet after I start talking, I do start singing my favorite Italian love songs. So just gonna tell you, we're gonna keep rolling here. That's the other thing, we'll keep moving. We have a great panel and great discussion coming up. So we will get to that very, very quickly. But we've not recognized our gavel sponsors in a while. So I wanted to take a minute to do that. Grand Bridge Real Estate Capital, Bowler Engineering, Tri-State Capital, Invest Pittsburgh, Firewater Response, Hillis Carnes Engineering Associates, the Pittsburgh Business Times, PNC, PJ Dick, Franjo Construction, Northeast Energy Advisors, ECS, Doble, Cohen and Company, Langen, Gateway, and CEC. Let's have a round for our sponsors who basically bought us all breakfast this morning. Some quick announcements, some upcoming events. The DL Project Tour for April 28th. My understanding that's almost sold out. So if you want to go, you better book that today. The awards banquet, we're on track for over 900 people to attend that at Stage AE, and that's May 19th. So again, if you have not got your tickets, you want to get that done soon. The June 6th golf outing, again, it's my understanding that's just about sold out. So if you're at all interested, reach out to Erica today. The crew shooting event at Seven Springs in June 17th, the clay shoot, put that on your calendar. The DL golf outing, that's now booked for August 17th. So, and I do want to highlight our advocacy efforts, and that really falls into a lot of our discussion this morning. We particularly have been working with the mayor's office on affordable housing, what they call affordable housing, what we call taxation of development projects for subsidized housing. So we've actually been having very serious discussions with them about that. You'll be seeing more about that in the news. So again, your involvement in NAIOP helps us with that. So it's a very important issue. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this morning, who is going to introduce our guests, Tobiah Bilski with JLL Properties, and he's their research director for demographics. So please give a warm welcome to Toby. I'm sorry, we're gonna have Chris Briem from the University of Pittsburgh. A little warmer welcome, please.
It's all good, sir. How you said? Make sure my, so good morning. So I'm not quite set up to see my own slides here, so I'm gonna have to remember what I put up for you. So I'm here to give you a brief introduction to sort of change in Pittsburgh. Maybe I'll brief self-introduction. I work for the what's called the Urban and Regional Analysis Program at the University Center for Social and Urban Research. So I actually focus mostly on regional competitiveness, why Pittsburgh as a region grows or changes. But what happens is understanding that I've had to become something of an expert in demography, among other things, because we have some very unique demographics here in the Pittsburgh region. And if you don't sort of take that into account, all your other sort of forecasts and analysis really gets to be pretty flawed. So, but I'm going to talk about what I'm going to talk about today is three quick things. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned from the 2020 census, which made some headlines, which some of you have seen. I'm going to talk about where we're going to, what we know since the 2020 census is now 2022, right? So we're moving ahead. I'm going to get into sort of very briefly, again, I'm here just give you a brief overview, spur some questions between us and the other panel, and anything questions you have afterwards. The impacts of COVID obviously is probably on everyone's mind. And then really just a little bit talk about the daily topic for me is sort of what's going on to the workforce here in Pittsburgh. So real quick, you probably all have seen these headlines. You know, this came out from the 2020 census. We've seen some growth in areas we haven't seen for a long time. This was, you know, saying Allegheny County saw some growth. the region saw some growth in a region that has not seen a lot of growth for many decades. Certainly here in the city of Pittsburgh, there's some stable population, but even that's sort of a great shift from a trend of almost 7 years of decline. So I get to start out with sort of a bit of good news that we do have some growth. It's certainly not even through the region. Let me start with this one here for a minute. So look, through the region, obviously that one story, we see the aggregate headlines when we think it's the same for everyone. Obviously it's not. There's sort of different stories for each of the counties. I've highlighted here sort of the counties that have the most absolute numbered growth and decline and the absolute percentage growth rates of decline. So we sort of see some similar patterns. I think the fastest growth there is still Butler. I think the fastest decline still Fayette. These are sort of trends that have been going on for a long time. Westmoreland County, all these counties have sort of their own individual stories. I'll go back though just for a minute. This breaks down the long-term trend of growth and decline by decade. And I've broken this out for Allegheny County and the remainder of the region just for illustrative purposes. And I think it's sort of showing that one of the stories from the 2020 census is that the last decade we saw some interesting growth in the urban core. And so Allegheny County is growing. Usually it's been the laggard in the region, but really for the first time in many years, Allegheny County sort of is doing well compared to most everywhere else. Sure. So the question is, where is growth and decline coming from? Really, just so you understand that growth and decline from a demographic standpoint, it only comes from what's called natural population change, which is the difference between births and deaths, and also migration flows. And migration flows in and flows out. So the question of this growth over the last decade in the region in Allegheny County is, so when did it happen? And this is just a quick picture of, which one's next, of net migration. So that the difference between whether more people are moving into the region or moving out. If you know the story of Pittsburgh, tremendous economic manufacturing contraction 30, 40 years ago, we've been sort of defined by pretty massive outflows of population. The story over the last decade is that if you actually go back to really the end of the Great Recession, that 2009, 2010, 2011 period, we actually experienced several years of net population gain because of migration. I think I did this by color, you can sort of see. And so the truth is, so it was good that we saw some growth over the last decade. It probably happened at the front end of that decade. The front end of that decade was the impacts of the Great Recession. Many of you kind of know that part of this audience knows pretty well, sort of the subprime crisis did not hit here anywhere near that it did many other large metro areas, many other large urban areas. And we actually were faring pretty well from that sense. And then on top of that, those years also coincided with sort of that peak investment period for the fracking build out. Was all those things were bringing people into the region for a couple of years. It probably hasn't been true for the last several years. And so we've sort of dipped back into sort of net losses due to migration. The other big reason, the other source of population change is natural population change. Sorry. So the story here is, we are unfortunately an older region. Again, the loss of folks, we are still being impacted by change many decades ago. The scale at which people left here in the early 80s meant that really was a very age selective migration. It was very much a younger population. That's when we became we were kind of an older region going into the 80s. We came out of the 80s, one of the oldest regions. And that sort of has played out. We've had what's called natural population decline, more deaths than births since the mid 1990s. So it's not new. It will be a phenomenon affecting almost all other regions in the country more and more. In fact, you might be seeing lots of headlines that the really COVID has accelerated that. There are all sorts of regions and whole states that are experiencing this for the first time. We've been there for quite a while. And unfortunately, this is where we're at in terms of our aging population now. I point this out not to be overly dour, but it reflects economic change decades ago. It's kind of been baked into the demographics. It doesn't reflect our ability these days to attract and retain investment. We might be doing great, and I think we are doing pretty well in lots of different vectors. a competitive region, attracting investment and growth. But nonetheless, this core piece of population is declining. And we've actually seen, unlike the rest of the country over the last couple of decades, the decline in the older population, which is very counter to some of the headlines you might have seen as the nation's baby boom generation ages. Most regions are getting older. Well, our baby boom population are the folks who mostly left in the early 1980s. So it's a very different set of demographics. So anyway, I think I already said this. Most of our change, the recent growth rates, I wish I could say that they're sort of going to continue, but probably not. I mean, the nation is tremendously challenged by a couple things. In general, natural population growth for the nation is pretty flat. We don't have, fertility rates, and we don't have enough kids as we used to have. At the national level, most population change is going to be coming from international immigration. And that's been very curtailed the last few years, first because of COVID and then for other reasons. And so that pool of folks that we can sort of attract here from international sources is pretty low. But the bigger impact that unfortunately is impacting all regions, and I think this gets to a lot of what's going on here in Pittsburgh, is that domestic migration flows are very low. And this is not a new phenomenon per se. Really, it comes back to the Great Recession. It's been studied that the rate at which people are moving between regions is much lower. We are very much defined as a very mobile population, a mobile workforce, but the Great Recession has pushed those numbers down. They haven't quite come back. And then COVID hit, which pushed it down more. And this is sort of an active field of research as to why, but it means that, the source of being able to bring people into the region is probably much more difficult than it has been sort of in the past. And it's been relatively difficult here in the past for quite a while. COVID, I'm skipping here to COVID just briefly, COVID impacts and these demographics. This is a breakdown of that natural population change into its components, births and deaths. And so what we've seen here is very clearly, COVID had some, I only play an epidemiologist on TV, but we're here to, the death rate has spiked. That sort of had a real population impact here. There was some debate as whether there'd be a baby boom or not. There really hasn't been because of COVID, and that has sort of spiked this natural population change, unfortunately, in a negative here for the next few years, at least where we're at right now. Let's skip over this real quick. I'm going to skip just real quick. I think the topic that hits me all the time, and how these demographics hit many of you, either in your employer role or just maybe you hear about it in your clients or your colleagues, is this issue of what's happening to the labor force. And this is a quick look at how our labor force has changed over the last couple of years relative to where we were just a couple of years ago for the 40 largest metro areas. And this is actually somewhat troubling in terms of tremendous amount of folks who sort of went out of the labor force because of COVID. They've been coming back in many regions, but we're not quite seeing that here. And the way I just phrased that is actually the way I don't want you to think about this. I think there's sort of a myth out there that there's a bunch of folks who sort of left the workforce and they've been sitting out and they're waiting to come back in for whatever, health reasons, economic reasons, whatever. And it's been, we're into 2+ years here in COVID, or maybe we're coming up on that. It's not quite true. At least I would suggest that it's not true that there's a body of folks who have left the workforce waiting to jump back in. There's been sort of some structural shifts, people who have made early retirement decisions who could easily have left the region. We have issues with younger folks not working like they did before through COVID. I thought that was because they weren't here. A lot of students who were attending virtually weren't physically here to work. But I actually think what's happening at this point is, again, just this issue of migration and attracting workforce to the region. This issue of tight labor markets is affecting all regions. And so, if you were, like I said, 10 years ago, we were attracting folks into the region because there was a recession, but things weren't as bad here as elsewhere. People were finding job opportunities here. People are finding those job opportunities where they're at. And so if you're, something sort of motivating you to move for a job, you have opportunity. It's always it costs more to move, costs more economically, costs more psychically, for you to pick up and move between regions. You've got to have a pretty significant incentive to do that. And again, these diminished migration flows across the country are probably coming from the fact that most people are finding those job opportunities where they're at. And so probably what's happening at this point of why our labor force hasn't come back is sort of a diminished flow of folks moving into the region for jobs and just sort of the normal churn of jobs otherwise. This is an ongoing topic. And so I don't say that's a definitive answer right now, but it's sort of the big link between demographics and the local economy, because obviously if you can't find the workers to hire, you're sort of impeded in your future growth and all that. So I think I've skipped through a whole lot of things. I think I can certainly will take up questions here at the end, so I'm not going to do it right now. I think I'll turn over and sort of do the panel, and we'll talk more about this after that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here to moderate this important discussion. My name is Tobiah Bilski. I'm the research manager for JLL Pittsburgh. A little bit about us. We're a Fortune 200 company. We have about 100,000 employees worldwide, and we're going on 600 here locally. And I just want to preface this discussion by saying, part of our job is that we have a group that focuses on site selection. And a variable that we look at is, you guessed it, population growth. So this is a very important discussion for us to have. And I'll let you guys start to introduce yourself. We already heard from Chris, but Jim, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Jim Futrell. I'm Vice President of Market Research for the Allegheny Conference. Been in that position for about 20 years, supporting the business investment efforts of the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance, providing demographic, economic, business, and workforce data to companies to hopefully help them make their decision to come to Southwestern Pennsylvania.
Morning, everyone. Hello, there we go. Good morning, all. I'm Susie Puskar. Thank you so much for having me. I am the brand new Chief Policy and Research Officer with Partner for Work. We are the Workforce Development Board for Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, which means we connect job seekers in need of jobs with businesses in need of talent. So while I am newly minted in this role, I've been at Partner for Work for about 8 years, serving as Chief Program Officer and Director of Youth Programming. So well familiar with some of the demographic trends that Chris has spoken about recently.
Great.
Hello again.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so we'll start off. I'll start with Jim here. After what we just learned from Chris as well, Pittsburgh is often, it's not often, but it's overlooked sometimes when compared to the hyper-growth cities like Raleigh or Nashville or Austin. And looking at Chris's presentation where it said that the population increases from 2019 to 2020 in the top 40 cities, 4 out of those 5 cities were in Texas, right? So my question is, why have other cities been more successful in attracting talent or population? Maybe why is it that Texas is attracting the most? So go ahead, Jim, and give us your thoughts.
Well, I think, with Texas, that's not really a recent phenomenon. Texas is ranked among the fastest growing states for decades. And if you look at history, I think it's a good illustration about changing these demographic trends is not something that can happen overnight, barring getting an HQ2 or something like that. But in the case of Texas, there was the energy boom in the early 80s. That was the same time that we were seeing the emergence of the Rust Belt from, in that region stretching essentially from Pittsburgh through Wisconsin. So you saw this migration of people from the industrial heartland down to Texas for those opportunities. And it was essentially baby boomers bringing their children. And you see that still lingering here in Pittsburgh's demographic trends. And at the same time, it was really when that next great wave of immigration happened here in the United States, primarily driven by Asian and Latin immigrants. And Texas was a very popular landing spot because of the job opportunities there. Now, they've been able to sustain that over time because they do have a reputation of being a very business-friendly state. And so that attracts new business investment, which attracts more people. So it's a self-sustaining thing.
Okay, great. Chris, do you have any thoughts as well?
Well, I don't know if these windows are shaded, but you can look outside and answer this question pretty quickly. Why Florida and Texas are doing well. I heard on the radio yesterday, kind of interesting thing. It was talking about some other news in Florida, but some expert down there said the business of Florida is population growth. And I thought that fits in pretty well with sort of this discussion. I mean, climate and weather matters a lot. The historical shift of population in the U.S. are things that we're not going to sort of adjust in that sense. And then, as Jim alluded to a bit, 70% of the local economy is providing goods and services to the resident population here, at least. And so there is sort of this, as Jim phrased it, sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. But where regions have sort of, for other regions, been generating population growth, they will sustain. When we lost population here in the 1980s, those folks who left were typically younger workers. They took with them their families and their future families. And that's why there's sort of we're long past the decline of steel from a sort of an economic competitive standpoint, but the demographic impacts are everywhere here today. And the opposite is true in Texas and Florida, places that have, for typically other reasons, climate, but attracted large flows of international immigrants, have generated other growth because of that. So those typical trends are there. I wouldn't say they're I think Pittsburgh can compete against that. Weather isn't going to kill you. This looks like Seattle outside, right? Seattle's doing great. So, I mean, it's not sort of going to end population growth, but it does constrain where we're at, certainly in the near term.
Okay, thank you. And then also I'm gonna throw some numbers out here now, and I hope you guys don't get mad at me for this challenging question. But according to CoStar, there's about 142,000 multifamily units in Pittsburgh, about 5% of which is vacant. And we have nearly 3,000 units under construction. We have a lot proposed downtown in the urban core as well. And, single family homes, anecdotally, we're seeing that, if you're trying to buy a home, good luck. It's very difficult. And so I guess my question is, with all the new development of single family homes, multifamily, and the number of people per households is remaining stagnant, right? So my question is, who's occupying all this residential if our population growth is not as high as other cities?
So there's a lot going on here. Obviously, I think, again, the long-term demographics matter a little bit. The number of folks we had per house here in Pittsburgh. I grew up in a neighborhood. I grew up in Bloomfield, by the way. It's typical Pittsburgh 2x2, 4 small rooms. People would have 3 generations in that household. I mean, that is not sort of where people want to live today. So we have sort of been adjusting our demand for residential supply. The demand across the region is very different. Obviously, folks where I work look around Oakland and the East End and think that reflects sort of this rate of residential growth investment across the region. I think that's pretty far from the truth. We can certainly find a whole bunch of regions where none of that is happening, or at least it's fairly moderate. We have a very old housing stock here, probably the oldest housing stock in the country here, right in the city, as many of you are probably aware. Not all of it is sort of the type of housing that a lot of people want to buy, right? Especially if you're a new professional person moving into the region, you have a short-term outlook, which is typical of elsewhere. You're not looking for a 20-year fixer-upper that you can buy here inexpensively. But I think there's a lot of shifting going on because of that. So, short answer.
No, and I'd add to that. I studied this issue a few years ago, and the number that really jumped out at me at that time was that 40% of the multifamily housing units in Allegheny County were built before 1940. So, we cannot attract a young tech-oriented workforce to this community if that's what your multifamily housing stock is. So I think a lot of that development is just upgrading our existing stock, bringing in more modern amenity-filled units to appeal to the current workforce.
Thank you. Next one, I'm aiming towards Susie. So Pittsburgh's labor force levels are below the US average, as Chris pointed out earlier. We heard his thoughts on where the labor force is kind of headed. But in your perspective, where do you see us having the best opportunity to differentiate and get those labor levels up?
When you look at the labor force participation rate, then you really need to break it down into demographics within that labor force participation rate. So historically, white men have a larger or a higher labor force participation rate than women do. Women of color have a lower labor force participation rate. Young people and people who are over the age of 55. We've all seen significant drops in labor force participation across the pandemic through those demographics. So if we are looking at a strategy that targets growth for only white men, then we won't achieve any challenges or changes to those labor force participation rates, and we won't have the workforce that we need in order to be able to attract businesses to the region. We have to differentiate those strategies, and we have to focus on creating career pathways and opportunities into the middle class, especially for people of color and for young people that currently live in the region.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a good segue into the next couple questions here. The next one's going to be focused on immigration. And so my question is, how will remote work and the remote schooling have an impact on Pittsburgh's ability to attract and retain the diverse workforce that we need? And what opportunities are there to improve that?
Sure. Remote work works for a certain subset of jobs that exist, right? As a person who works for the Workforce Development Board, we went remote in March of 2020. We didn't miss a step, right? We came back and things are great and we love being back in the office, but my job was one that was very easily transferred back home. There are a number of jobs, however, that are not available to focus or to work remotely. And that's where we have an opportunity to really invest in community and build those pipelines into those job opportunities. To the point that Chris made about 70% of the economy being service industry and services to people who live in that region, we really need to focus our efforts on creating short-term credentialing opportunities, on helping employers understand that seat time is less important than competency and take risks on a population and get past just this conversation about diversity into true equity and inclusion into the investments they are making. Because if we create a diverse pipeline of people into these jobs, but then we don't support them once they're there, and we don't change the cultures at the organizations that are hiring a more diverse pipeline, we're not going to actually create those changes that we need to see in order to thrive as a region.
Let me just frame this a little bit in that, this question of remote work, maybe everything we talk about here has two angles. There's the inter-regional aspect and there's intra-regional. So this remote work issue, I think probably for many of you sort of focus on, growth within the region. The intra-regional piece matters. You're in downtown, the long-term impacts of remote work and the shifting where people work is a huge topic, which I'm not sure I can even begin to address here. But the inter-regional piece, I think, just keep in mind, this talks about labor force. There are a lot of folks who talk about, hey, Pittsburgh is a headline the other day, affordable place. People want to live here, keep their salaries from other regions, and that could be a benefit. And I don't disagree with that. I think that is a potential. I'm not quite sure we're seeing it as much as I'm sure I can think of anecdotal examples, many of you can, but it works the other way too, in that if you're a local employer and you hire folks, well, this shift to remote work has meant that your workers that you're used to paying Pittsburgh wages are now, being sucked up by or being, poached by employers across the country who can say, hey, stay where you're at. Let me pay you this other salary and hire here. So that's put a challenge on local workers, on local employers in a way that people don't realize. So it works both ways. I can't begin to say which way it's going to benefit Pittsburgh or not. But I think there's as much of a challenge there as an opportunity going forward in terms of how labor force impacts the competitiveness of Pittsburgh as a region going forward.
And one of the things I would add too is one thing I noticed in the 2021 population estimates that came out a couple weeks ago is there seemed to be more of a push to the exurban areas. So, among the benchmark communities we measure Pittsburgh against, Boston had the largest year-over-year population drop. But if you looked at the map, you saw a lot of growth in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, just beyond the reaches of Boston. So I think another thing that will be impacting this going forward is people still need to maintain that physical connection to their office. But if you only have to come in, 2, maybe 3 days a week, you don't need to be living close to that physical office like you do because you don't have that 5-day-a-week grind. So I think you might see that impact of people moving a little bit further out into the exurban areas to take advantage of the lower cost of living, maybe buy an old Victorian that they can renovate. But still, you're not going from Boston to some mountaintop in Vermont or Montana to work on your laptop.
And so expanding on that question, everyone I think here touched upon livability, affordability, job growth in the different, innovative sectors. So my question would be, at the same time, we've seen reports and surveys that say minorities do not feel the same way towards affordability or livability. And so is there signs of this improving? We've been discussing this for a while now, but are there signs of this inclusion topic improving in Pittsburgh?
So let me address this briefly. So I obviously, speaking as I am as a white male, I can speak to this not to a certain degree, but we certainly do focus on this a lot. I mean, this issue of young African Americans, or maybe the African American population in the city of Pittsburgh, has been declining rapidly. And by that, I mean more rapidly than it has ever in the past, and more rapidly than it is in any other sort of comparable city. There's a bit of a misunderstanding in that, that people are, what is Pittsburgh that they're fleeing? It's not the region per se. It is pretty clear that the decline in the Black population in the city of Pittsburgh is offset, even, more than offset, by the growth in the Black population in the suburbs within Allegheny County. So we're seeing this massive shift of folks from the city into mostly the eastern and southeastern suburbs. We can sort of name all the regions that are seeing that type of growth. Why are they moving out? I can't answer entirely, but obviously this issue of affordability is probably one of them. And so you're seeing East Liberty and east end of Pittsburgh has some historical African American populations going down quite rapidly as I'm talking here. But there's equally balanced growth in the eastern suburbs, into Plum and Penn Hills, into the Mon Valley. How to address that, I think, is an ongoing issue. I mean, I believe that we have this ongoing discussion with all the folks of how to address and arrest that. But I don't think it's stopped. It's probably accelerating at the moment.
I think the short answer to your question is no. At the macro level, we're not making the changes that we need to make. At the micro level, we are making some changes. And what we've seen in employers and working with employers right now throughout the pandemic is that the shifts in the labor market have caused such a crunch that employers are much more willing to give a little bit of power back to the employee. And as the Workforce Development Board, we're trying to take full advantage of that however we can, right? So creating job quality efforts and helping employers to understand that people as a resource are something that need to be cared for in a way that that creates opportunity for them to thrive. And so that means in a lot of cases, thinking about trauma-informed HR practices and recognizing that employees bring their whole lives to their workforce and to their day. And that means supporting them in a different way than we have historically supported employees overall. Changes like that. And when we think about job quality, we don't just think about wages, which is kind of where some people start and stop the conversation. It's about thinking about employees as parents and making sure that they have opportunities if they need to take time off to take care of their children, or maybe with the generational shifts that we're seeing, a lot of employees are also taking care of their own aging parents. It's about things like benefits and making sure that employees have healthcare benefits so that a healthcare crisis doesn't affect when they're able to come to work. So all of those job quality efforts that we're starting to see employers being forced into in some ways, those are improving conditions across the board for workers, which of course lifts all boats. But we need to be very intentional about how individuals of color, how young people need to have supports in the workplace if we're going to make an impact on this overall.
Thank you. And so I'm the commercial real estate research guy, so I'm going to throw some more numbers at you. But from 2015 to now, we've had about 2 million square feet of urban migration of office users and new to market tenants moving to the urban core. And in Pittsburgh, if you look at the inventory of office in the submarkets, it's about 50-50 from the suburbs to the urban submarkets. So, having this much activity happening within the urban core, in the presentation we saw Allegheny County, Butler County, Washington County, all seeing population gains, which aligns with this sort of office activity, right? But then we see in the paper just recently that Westmoreland County had a net migration gain over the past year. And then you talked a little bit, Chris, about migration of minorities into the suburbs. Is this the start of a population migration into the suburbs because of the remote work, perhaps? Is it sustainable?
Well, I'll pick up on what I was saying about Boston too. What in the 21 population estimates, what was really interesting is not only Westmoreland, but Armstrong, Indiana, and Lawrence counties all had positive domestic migration, which meant there were more people moving into those counties from elsewhere in the United States than moving out. And that hasn't happened in those counties in decades. So I do think that is we're seeing some of the people moving a little bit further out from the urban core because they don't have to maintain that 5-day-a-week physical connection to their employer. It will be interesting to see if that is sustained. Now, unfortunately, the gains they had from the positive domestic migration were more than offset by the natural population increase, which is going to still be something we have to deal with. But it was a really interesting trend because really, historically, Butler, Washington, and sometimes Allegheny were the only counties in the region that would have positive domestic migration.
I mean, I guess just I caution a bit, that the COVID impacts I think are ongoing and dynamic. So the last few years, obviously people have been making shifts that they weren't anticipating. It's a bit unclear whether those shifts will continue into the future. We certainly expect remote work. Remote work before the COVID was growing, but at very glacial rates. The predictions of growth of telework and working from home had been proceeding pretty slowly. We've obviously skipped ahead a decade or so. We might have we absorbed all of that for the near term, maybe as people shift back to working at least some partially in where they physically were before. We might not see the same sort of patterns going forward. I'm trained not to treat anecdotes as data, but I do have I do know of someone who was in the middle of COVID buying a house in Latrobe because they anticipated work from home. And they were literally on the verge of closing, and like a week before closing, their employer said, "No, we're all moving back to working in the office," and that sort of shut that down. I don't know where we're going to be here in a few years. I suspect we'll have a lot more working away from physical concentration, central business districts. But I don't know. I suspect the future will not look like any of us are predicting, but we'll find out.
Thank you. And then to wrap up my questions before I open it up to the room here, I'd like to get everyone's thoughts. So everyone, please chime in. So what is Pittsburgh's best path forward from here? What is our unique job creation opportunity that can help secure our economic growth?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, we're seeing, some of the things we're seeing, the technology industry continues to be strong, but that's a, industry that disproportionately benefits the urban core. So what do we need to do to help turn things around in some of those areas that really are struggling with sustained employment and population loss. We're getting ready to release the results of our business investment scorecard. And some of the things I've seen in there was a really strong rebound in manufacturing announcements this year. Manufacturers announcing plans to add jobs, the continued growth in distribution centers, and it's not just Amazon. I think one of the impacts of COVID is there's been this fundamental shift in the way that companies look at their distribution networks, and they no longer need a gigantic distribution center in Harrisburg and one in Columbus to serve the entire northeastern United States. They're going to be doing a lot more more moderate sized distribution centers to provide much quicker access, and I think probably to help build in a buffer so they're not overly reliant on just-in-time inventory coming in from overseas. Those are two of the things we've seen. I think it's been interesting to also see the impact in the types of announcements we're seeing. That trend, at least in the near term, that trend has been away from companies announcing plans to open new branch offices, expand their headquarters into more of the facilities that you can't really transition to a hybrid or remote environment. So the share of announcements from manufacturing plants, distribution centers, and R&D centers really have increased in the past couple of years.
Sure. So I think one of the things that we have to really think about as we look at where Pittsburgh can differentiate itself is in thinking about those middle skill jobs that don't require a college degree, and thinking about what pathways we can create and how employers can help to drive what those training programs look like. Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh area is a hub for the US Navy to build out $700 billion worth of submarines in the next 10 years. And manufacturers are struggling to find the talent that they need in order to be able to create springs and valves and all of those things for the submarine parts. So creating those opportunities and those shorter term training opportunities that will really help to ensure that people can be ready for those middle skill jobs, I think will help us grow as a region.
I'm just excited. As a 36-year veteran of the Navy Reserve, I'm happy to hear about our Navy connections here. Only because Jim brought up scorecards. I'll be real brief. I teach a course in economic development, and I talk to the students about this question of what the metrics are of success, which is really how we define whether we're doing well. The question is how to do better. The question is, what does that really mean? And again, I point out this issue. There's really two economies here and everywhere. What's the service part for the local population, the part that's sort of really the industries that are businesses that are export oriented, not internationally, just to the world outside Pittsburgh. And those are two very different economies. And I've been fighting this battle for really decades now. That people stare at the population growth number and think it means a lot to certain industries. It may mean a lot to folks in this room, since obviously folks who are developers in real estate and construction really matters to that piece of what's going on here locally, but not entirely. A lot of your clients that are building out are for businesses that are serving a broader region. And so I've been trying to push people away from over-interpreting the top line population numbers, which can be very dour. Doesn't mean we're not doing very well at attracting investment. Jim touched upon the things that are doing well, could do well. The Navy business is all obviously not locally serving in that sense. So if we can sort of think about it those two different ways, we can address different policies for different parts of the economy and sort of manage that way. The top line number and the employment numbers follow from that, because 70% of the jobs really follow from the demographics. And if it's something, you might not see top line employment growth the way you might want in other regions. It doesn't mean that we're not competitively building new businesses and industries here for the long run.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, so we have about 5 minutes left. I want to thank the panelists for answering my questions. I know they weren't easy, but I want to open up to the room if anyone else has questions for these experts. We have one over there.
So like POH Architects, so the birth rate, death rate, pretty steady. Over the last few years, the dialogue and integration has been extremely negative. attract immigrants to have support for an immigration policy that we can have immigrants come in, because the rhetoric of immigrants over time have always been successful in a large percentage and have started businesses. We can look in Pittsburgh at some companies that have grown tremendously that have been started by immigrants. So I don't see the region or any of our industry associations really loudly speaking forward to immigration, because that is the only way America is going to grow. So I'd like to comment on that.
We have 3 minutes for a lifelong conversation here. I mean, look, but the point that I would take you to walk away from that, I would agree with what you said. Personally, I think we could find our colleagues in town who have focused on sort of supporting immigrant groups here for a long time. We have tremendous immigrant groups here who really came here. I show a picture of the Tamburitzans, we think immigrants and groups in Pittsburgh. Those aren't current immigrants. Those are the grandchildren of the immigrants who really sort of flooded into Pittsburgh at this point. The top line number of immigration at the moment we're at, for whatever is all the reasons that have caused it, immigration flow into the U.S. is small. So, Pittsburgh is not the pie of potential folks moving in is pretty small, and some things well above our pay grade in a sense have to change for that. So I just don't think it's going to be a source of population growth here in the near term in the palpable sense that it is in the way it's sort of driven the economies of sort of South Texas or parts of Florida, unfortunately.
And yeah, I mean, Chris alluded to domestic migration as one of these broader national trends that we're having to deal with, but the drop in immigration, international immigration, is another one. That 2021, it was half of what it was in 2020, and it has been declining for years. And that has been really one of the bright spots we had through most of the last decade. It had been increasing. So, we're going to have the national trends to working against us. That's going to challenge us in terms of the immigration side of it. I know one of the things we're doing at the Allegheny conference is looking at some of the what I would say low-hanging fruit. And so we have this initiative, Pittsburgh Passport, which is supposed to, we're trying to better integrate college students. We have 130,000 college students here in the region, 40,000 of them a year graduate, and 20,000 of them leave the region. If we can, so that's half. So if we could increase that retention from 50 to 60%, that's an additional 4,000 people that are going to be living in the region every year. So that's one of the initiatives that I think could have an immediate impact. I think that then the issue then becomes, are there enough entry-level jobs for them to start a career here and sustain that?
Mentioned that in order to grow our workforce, there is a missing segment in the minority population. And if employers reached out and created a pathway and then supported that pathway, it would have an effect. There's a lot of employers in this room. And you gave some examples of short certification, short training, but what can the employers do after they're in a position other than offering benefits and things like that to help create that pipeline that doesn't exist?
That's a great question. Thank you. So we at the Workforce Development Board help employers figure that out. And so I'm happy to talk about this more in depth with anyone who wants after this. But things like employee resource groups, where you give authority and autonomy to groups within your organization to create and challenge policies so that they are friendlier for those for those employees. So that could be single parents, it could be people of color, it could be young people, it could be people who took a non-traditional pathway into your business. So for a lot of employers who have a lot of white collar workers, that might be employees who came to you with only a high school degree and not an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. Creating the opportunity for those employees to change policies and to help advise you on what things would make that environment friendlier for them. looking at your metrics across your organization to identify, are there biases in the way that you're hiring people? Are there biases in the way that you're promoting people? How are you looking at whether there are pathways for those employees who have come in non-traditional ways? Are they getting into management and director roles? Those are all things that there are resources like a tool called Working Metrics that you can look at and explore. What are we doing and how are we doing compared with our peer organizations to create the atmosphere that creates opportunities for inclusion?
Brandon?
So from a population standpoint, one thing that I really try to stress to folks within the urban core is that we almost need some spillover effects because there are lots of places outside of not just the urban core, but it's especially outside of Allegheny County that have not seen investment in decades. We've seen kind of two separate economies form. We've seen places that continually have seen investment, or we also have places in our region that have seen the opposite. So how do we educate folks on a place like Austin or they've seen so long spillover effects that neighborhoods and regions, 4, 5 counties over are seeing investments that they haven't seen in decades. How do we communicate that, as a policy?
Good question.
So as asked, that's a tough question to compare us to Austin. I debate that with folks all the time. What the differences are between here and Austin. Again, going back to my students,
I'll change that to Columbus.
Yeah, Columbus. Well, Columbus. Nonetheless, I mean, the way I talk to my students about this is, this issue of what we some people phrase left behind places, and we certainly, again, the residual of the industrial contraction here and the rust creation of the Rust Belt is where we can all name a whole number of reasons. Certainly, when you sort of even push just out beyond the metro area, the Johnstowns, the Altoonas, the Wheelings, and the Weirtons are all places that one could argue have not found that post-industrial path going forward. And I get these questions. My only answer, and I don't claim to have all the answers here, is for the many parts of the region that have not sort of have that apparent sort of growth or apparent trajectory to attract residents or new businesses they're not going to go back to the size. Not few of them will ever come near to the sizes they were in the past, but the path to prosperity, to viability as a community, is to ensure that they have connectivity to the growth in the region. I think we have a persistence of memory here in this region. And the concept of industry here and the workers here, and you could walk from the south side slopes to the J&L plant on the bottom of the hill, and that everything was kind of insular in that sense, is not the way the world works anywhere. And so if you want to be a viable place in the Mon Valley, it's not because the jobs are going to be there. The people who want to choose to live in the Braddock of the future will have to have access and connectivity to the jobs elsewhere. And then the jobs will have to, the people who live elsewhere will want to, find reasons to locate businesses there. They're not going to be insular. It's all about sort of making sure those communities, the left behind places, which I think is sort of what you're getting at, are connected to whatever growth and the poles of growth that we're defining elsewhere that we've touched upon. That's the closest I come to an answer when I get that question. But
Well, I would think another issue that is probably resonates with the people in this room is you bring up Columbus, but if you look at Columbus, their topography is like that tabletop. And so for them, they recently landed Intel because they had that huge parcel of land that was ready to start construction on, and the state was able to demonstrate to them that they had the workforce programs in place to staff that, those people with those very specific skills that they were going to need. So I think, it's, you can learn a lot from that, and that, to get to where you're talking about, you need, the sites that are ready to go, They need to be able, the company needs to be able to start construction immediately. So the permitting issue has to be resolved. And we also have to guarantee that once they put that building there, we're going to be able to get them the workers that they need.
I would almost add as well, to talk about that and how flat Columbus is, or maybe even Texas, how they have a beltway system in place that allows connectivity for employees to get to wherever they need to get to, right? But Pittsburgh, all roads lead to the downtown. And so the urban core has kind of benefited from that, but left the outskirts kind of in the dust. So I'd say the investments being made, like the Southern Beltway, that's certainly helping on the west side. But then also communities have to be receptive to certain employment opportunities. Talking about Amazon and Churchill, of course, but that's a different conversation. But I'd say the connectivity is another variable that we look at for site selection. Logistically, does it make sense, as well as population growth? Sure. We can do one more, Brandon, or? Okay. Yeah.
So Seth Davis from Port Authority, I caution against that pushing out to the periphery a little bit. There was a public source article that was counterpoint to the sort of affordability. There was a young woman in the north side, wanted to stay there in the north side, she ended up buying it. And I think while she stabilized her housing, she destabilized her access to her family, destabilized her access to childcare, destabilized her access to transportation. It's very difficult as a Port Authority to move service to an area that doesn't already have service. We have light rail system, we have our fantastic busways. Emphasizing in areas where people already need to stay, I think is a crucial element. And I don't know if we have a silver bullet to that. I'm personally looking for a house in Mount Lebanon hormone area right now. So when affordability comes up, it's striking to me when they say it's affordable. So just to be fair.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that was a question or a comment. I'll react to that. Like probably before your time, I agree with everything you say in that, in fact, the Port Authority cut lots of routes to Penn Hills about 10 years ago. And I have a colleague I know is writing a whole book on the impact of loss of transit in Penn Hills at that time. So we could talk about that forever. I'll throw out there, since you mentioned a couple of things that you're looking for a house. I think you all might know this, maybe on the front end of this, or maybe not. I think there's a tremendous impact in the last few years of third-party REITs coming into the region in ways that they didn't before, buying into that single-family home market and really buying those homes at a first-time buyer, whatever, second, an early buyer, second-time buyer, or buying up. I think that we haven't quite seen that here in the past, not at the scale that we've seen here of the large-scale purchasing in Penn Hills of property by these third-party REITs that are really coming in with cash offers and giving local folks tremendous. Only because I think we're in now. I'll end with one quick thought. If I can just go back real quick, unless there's, I don't want to, I warned my colleagues I talk too much, but I apologize. This issue of spillovers and growth in the urban core is interesting. I point out a factoid that people seem to not believe. People in the Pittsburgh region have moved away from the city of Pittsburgh for 60 or 70 years. We might have reached a certain stability in recent years, and that's a tremendous accomplishment. The jobs in the region have located where they are. There were about 300,000 jobs located in the city of Pittsburgh in the 50s and 1960. There are 300,000 jobs located in the city of Pittsburgh today. That is not something that many older urban northeastern cities can say, and it's there are all sorts of reasons for it. The jobs have stayed where they are. In fact, you could argue that, again, a little complicated. We used to support a larger population. A lot more of those service jobs had to be located in the city. Those have been replaced by jobs that aren't service jobs anymore. So in fact, the urban core here is a tremendously competitive place for the location of jobs compared to most other sort of large urban cities in the region. So that's the challenge. And that we get into issues of spatial mismatch, which again, go to our friends at the Port Authority, and the challenges of, the access to transit. Once you get beyond sort of the city, certainly in the last 10 years gets pretty minimal. So that's goes to my issue of, we want the former Rust Belt regions, the left behind places, to be successful. They're going to have to be connected by transit, by road, psychically, to the rest of the region. That's probably our biggest challenge going forward. Shut up now.
If I could just add to that, I think the interesting challenge is how an individual views connectivity is completely different than how a business potentially would view it. That's probably a whole other session.
Great, thank you. Can we have a hand for our panel? Thank you. And will you guys be staying up here for a few minutes afterwards? So if you have any other questions, come on up here. And again, this highlights the importance of NAIOP Pittsburgh. We are your voice for these issues to our elected officials. So your involvement here is very important for that. And again, please check out the website for the upcoming events that we have coming. And that's it. Thank you very much for coming today.
What do you think? Do you want us?